Hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Through Her Lens Conversations on Reframing the Domestic. Before we begin, I'd just like to make a few introductions. Zubaan is a feminist publishing house and NGO that chronicles and participates in women's movements in India and South Asia. We are conducting this webinar as part of Zubaan and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation's Fragrance of Peace project, which aims to broaden the scope of research and literary work in the northeastern states of India by strengthening existing networks, building new partnerships, and facilitating cultural exchange. This webinar series is running parallel to the online photo exhibition Through Her Lens Reframing the Domestic. Submissions are still open till 7th of June, and guidelines are up on our website. You'll also find a link to the submissions page in the chat box. You can also view the online exhibition and our previous webinars through the link in the chat box. Hi, I'm Mridu, and I'll be hosting the discussion today. This is the fourth and the final webinar in our series of conversations that hopes to engage with the issues of present challenges, the lockdown, the collapse of the public and the private space, the merging of paid, unpaid work, etc., and to see how all of this is affecting marginalized communities in the Northeast. This series also aims to look at the element of visual research and what photography and archiving in a COVID and post-COVID world means, especially now that the boundary between the storyteller and the story has collapsed and where stories have turned inwards. The topic of today's webinar is titled Alternative Art Spaces, Curating Marginalized Voices on Digital Platforms. And we will be joined by Dayanita Singh and Pema Abrahams. And I would just like to introduce the speakers for today. Dayanita Singh. Dayanita's art uses photography to reflect and expand on the ways in which we relate to photographic images. Her recent work, drawn from her extensive photographic oeuvre, is a series of mobile museums that allow her images to be endlessly edited, sequenced, archived, and displayed. Stemming from an interest in the archive, the museums present her photographs as interconnected bodies of work that are replete with both poetic and narrative possibilities. Publishing is also a significant part of her practice. In her books, she experiments with alternate forms of producing and viewing photographs. Dayanita's latest project is the Book Object, a work that is concurrently a book, an art object, an exhibition, and a catalog. Dayanita's Museum Bhavan has been shown at the Hayward Gallery in London, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art in New Delhi, and other prestigious institutions. She has also authored 12 books, including Zakir Hussain, House of Love, Museum of Chance, and Museum Bhavan, among others. Pema Abrahams. Pema has almost a decade of varied experience across South and Southeast Asia as a development professional and as a cultural heritage advocate. She now works as a consultant at the intersection of these two fields, strengthening public engagement with arts and culture initiatives in Asia and changing the conversations with stories that matter. Before returning to the cultural realm as a grantee of the British Library's Endangered Archives program to digitize the Sikkim Palace archives, Pema worked on issues of post-conflict reconciliation in Sri Lanka with International Crisis Group, on gender-based violence and access to justice for rural communities for the Asia Foundation, and for almost 5 years on a variety of systemic rights issues in Asia with Human Rights Watch. She has spoken at the V&A Museum's Culture in Crisis program and has articles published by Foreign Policy magazine, the Kathmandu Post, and Scroll.in, among others. So I would just like to go over a few rules for the participants attending today. Thank you so much for being here. Your video and audio have been automatically turned off on entry. Please do keep them so. Audience questions will be taken via the chat box, which we will close once we get a certain number of questions that can be answered today. However, the raise hand function will still be available to direct any queries at the host, which is me, and other hosts with Zubaan in their names. We will start dealing with audience questions around 4:45 p.m. If there's any speaker in particular you want to direct a question to, please make sure to mention that as well. However, we will not be taking leftover questions today. The discussion will be recorded and posted online via our social media channels. The list of participants will not be available. If you choose to ask a question via the chat box or speak, your name might be displayed during the webinar. The entry has been moderated to guard against trolling. No hate speech, targeting, or discriminating against any community will be tolerated. Any participants using such speech will be removed from the webinar without warning. The speakers have also given prior consent to be quoted outside of the webinar, so you're allowed to do so. So to begin the session, Dayanita, yesterday we had spoken very briefly about the changing notions of photography and the photographer. And you also spoke about going back to family albums and visual archives at home as a good starting place for including multiple communities in the self-documentation process. So would you like to expand on that?
I will. Before that, I just remembered an amazing thing, which is that in, I think, 1997, Kali for Books published a book object, really, which was way ahead of its time, I think, where they had photographs that I had taken alongside photographs my mother had taken. And that was 97. And already, I think, they had hit upon this idea of what is the difference. Today, when we say so-and-so is a photographer or somebody is photographing as a hobby, I don't really see the difference. That it's a time now where photography really is everybody's language, or everybody who has access to a mobile phone has access to that language, and thank God for it, because it is the language of the future and the present. So I would encourage people to not even think about, am I a photographer or not? Yes, if you want to earn a living, you might have to think of it in a slightly different way. But otherwise, the more people that are photographing their own world, their own circumstances, the more important and valuable the archives that come out of it will be. I think my mother would probably call herself a hobby photographer, as they used to in those days. But she's a really fantastic photographer, even though she just photographed her 4 daughters her entire life. She didn't photograph much else. She didn't have time for much else. She barely had time to photograph us, but she made wonderful pictures. And that before we had the notion of this kind of photo book, Kali for Women had already published that. So in a way, they were far ahead of their time, and I didn't even realize it then. And today, one could safely say that it would only help the situation of the archives that we need of this very important time in all our lives, if we don't worry about whether it's a hobby. I think anyone who has a camera and wants to make images, is photographing, is a photographer. So if we get that out of the way and hold on to my mother's example, frankly, I think she was a finer photographer than I can ever hope to be. Yet I'm known as the photographer, and she's considered the hobby photographer. It doesn't matter anymore. And especially all the mothers, I would so encourage you to make archives of your own children, of their circumstances, of the world around, as you see it, because that's what's the main thing. It's not just making images, but making images as you see them, photographing what interests you, and not just what you think is photographable or photogenic, or because you've applied for a grant, this is how the photo should be. There is no should be in photography. If there's something I look for, it's your voice, your very own voice. And that's what will make the difference to the archives we make, when you're not making the works thinking about how people will see them, but just what you want to see, what you want to document. And another idea, if it's okay, Mridu, I'll just throw it in now as well, is alongside forgetting about this distinction about hobby and whether I'm a photographer or not, would be to also see, wherever possible, if you can include text into your work, and to think of the idea of the visual journal as a way of keeping a record of your time. It could be newspaper clippings, it could be photos of shop windows, it could be pictures of your house, it could be text that you've read somewhere, a story your grandmother told you, a story someone in school told you. So if you can find a form in which you start combining the image and the text, which I do think is something that everyone working with photography might consider taking on in the future. Even that distinction, I think, is of the past now, that I'm a photographer and I'm a writer. And I think there are photographers already exploring the idea of using text alongside the images.
It's very interesting you say this, because we've received this series from healthcare workers in Assam. And although they're not aesthetically pleasing, as many photographers would say, but it's a self-documented series of their working at the community level. And they've also written poems as captions to accompany these images. So so this is one of my favorite series that we received.
Fantastic.
For the exhibition. So Pema, moving on to you, since you worked with the Sikkim Palace Archives, would you like to talk about the process of archiving and its importance?
Well, I think what I would like to just spin off is Dayanita's emphasis that this idea of labels is, that's decades old at this point. I've worn many hats, and I think the one that is most relevant here is the archive one, but I would never call myself an archivist. And I spent about 2 years solidly doing this with a very good team, all in Sikkim. Hopefully some of them are watching today. But it was something that I hadn't really set out to do. It was something that grew very organically and grew out of a very everyday moment. I was at my mother's place. She had a leak. The neighbor's place upstairs was leaking. The entire ceiling came in, and we were frantically moving boxes out. Boxes and boxes. And that night I stayed up all week. I stayed up going through these boxes, and there were more photographs on Sikkim and more documents on Sikkim there that week than I had seen in my entire life. I think up until that point in 2015, I thought only maybe 3 or 4 photographs of my grandmother existed, and that was it. And I've seen over 100 now, which really brings her to life and facilitates a connection to the past and your identity. I think around the world, communities and societies have this overarching tendency to root themselves in the past. It gives meaning to the present, and it helps people make sense of their identities. So, I mean, again, this happened very organically, but I think it's an indication that when you do something with intention and when you do something with passion, you can transcend labels. For me, it was really about a story to tell. Nowadays, whether discussions on Sikkim, whether they're academic or popular, especially conversations that concern a historical aspect of Sikkim, they really suffer from a paucity of sources. And this is exacerbated by the sensitivity of around the nature of its 1975 integration with India. And as a result, a lot of its in-depth study, I think, is quite restricted. It's difficult to have a balanced understanding of the region. Very little history is taught in schools, and there isn't a very accessible local archives in the state. So for a population of over 600,000 people, the consequences that this historical vacuum leaves, denying communities a sense of historical identity, as well as the facility of cultural preservation in a rapidly homogenizing India, can often be painful to acknowledge, and I think does our current generation, like you and me, an immense disservice. So I think what it comes down to is that when we let others tell our stories, we relinquish the power to tell our own stories. And up until the completion of our project, the history of Sikkim had only really been told through imperial British sources or later Indian sources. So this is the first collection of local origin that will allow researchers and curious Sikkimese to understand how events in the region were perceived from within. And I think, though my work dealt primarily with this kind of state archives, it's not, you know, it's not too dissimilar. The effects, the benefits, the perspectives from the kind of visual journals and family archives that Dayanita was talking about earlier. So I think it's really an important exercise, and if you can just get over the fact that you might not be a professional photographer or a professional archivist, there's really a lot of space there to make an impact.
Thank you so much, Pema. And as I was telling you before, we have a lot of photographers interested in archiving, and most of their practice, at least the ones in my network, they are interested in telling stories from the inside. You know, they feel that they have been represented and misrepresented by the outside forces for too long. And so we discussed this yesterday also. Most of the work is it's on the digital platform, right? And so when talking to them and asking them, do you want these works to translate into physical space, into an institution? So their concern was not about being represented by galleries in the commercial sense, but more in terms of getting grants and funds. And Dayanita, would you like to, because we spoke about the limitations of grants and also creating our own alternative, you know, ways to sustain our practice. So would you like to add to that?
Yes, I would. I have a lot of concerns about grants. We have a lot of grants starting now in India, which on one hand is a good thing, but there are some strange things happening with that as well. I'll just come to it. I'm not sure how much grants you need to pursue a work that you really want to do, is what I would tell your collective, Mridu. Because, you know, it's not a time where you need to buy film or pay for the processing or for contact sheets or prints, right? So the cost factor, other than buying your camera or your phone, is not there in photography anymore. So you could be doing any job and still doing photography. And so I don't think we have to keep waiting for grants. I don't think we have to keep waiting for an institute to invite you to do something. I think when you really want to do something, you're just going to go out and do it. So perhaps the question could be, how do we motivate ourselves to go out and do something? That to me is more the question, rather than how do we get the grants. However, if you feel that there is, you know, you want to take a year off from your job and you need a grant for that, I agree, then you have to look at the grants very carefully, because in my experience, you give a grant because you believe in somebody's work and you want to facilitate or celebrate that. What they do with the grant is really not your concern. To me, I have a hashtag now called grants are for giving. They're not for taking. And so you cannot give a grant. I mean, you can, people do, but if you're going to give a grant and you ask for prints in exchange, then that is a transaction. Then you have to be ready to pay the person for the year that they're going to take to make those images. Your grant is certainly not covering that. So you have to, when you apply for a grant, please read very carefully what is involved in it. So one is the fact that I don't think most grants are grants. I think they're commercial transactions. If they're commercial transactions, they should be fair to the photographer. You can't just hand over your work to somebody because you've done a grant. You do that when you have an assignment and you're being paid to do a job, but then don't call that a grant. The other problem with grants is that you have to write proposals. And you might write a proposal saying, I want to photograph the trees of Delhi and what's happening to them with pollution. And while you start looking around, you notice that there is a certain kind of house that is being built around the trees, whether it's at the street level, and you get more interested in housing around trees, and then you get more interested in innovative emergency housing. And so your mind has progressed to something else that may be far more relevant, but the grant holds you back to what you applied for. So in my understanding and experience, a grant has to allow you to explore. And so the people that give the grant have to have that faith in you that I'm going to send this money to the collective and they're going to do what they think is best with it. If I say I want such and such prints on such and such subject, I put shackles onto you. A grant is to free you. So grants are extremely problematic things. And if you are going to apply, please read the fine print very carefully and know what you're in for. And know that it will limit the accidents that can happen. My entire career is built on incredible accidents that have happened in my life that have led me to different works. If I was in any of them stuck to a grant, and once I was for that book, House of Love, and it was a grant from Robert Gardner for social issues. And finally, I convinced them that talking about romantic love is also a social issue. So I got away with it. But so much energy just went into sort of the fulfilling the proposal you wrote a year ago, you know? And hopefully a grant makes your mind expand. So how can your work remain as what you wrote in that beginning? And instead of waiting for grants and help, you look for ways to raise money for yourself. And if it is a digital platform, I was talking about Art Chain India, where you can sell your work within 10,000 rupees. And I think after 5 people have bought your work and you've collected 50,000, then you make a commitment to buy another artist's work. So granted that that's just working among the artists, but that's something that a group of, I think, young women thought up. And that's great. So maybe the collective needs to find ways to raise their own money, to do jobs that allow them to be close to what they want to photograph. That I don't think I do know many photographers, many extremely talented people have spent their lives waiting for that perfect grant. And I just feel you just have to go out and do it. And you have to be obsessed with it. And then you'll find ways to get the money to do it.
I agree with some of what you're saying. And when you said that it should be a grant which will really expand your mind, because I would like to talk about through our lens. When I approached Zubaan, we had this long standing conversation about like, why are there no women photographers? And when I approached Zubaan, it wasn't for an exhibition or anything big. It was just to hold a small talk on, get a photographer, Prashansa Guru, who's the only photographer, woman photographer we knew from Darjeeling, to get her to Namchi and just talk about, what can we do next to like really bring the women photographers out. But so now then, because of the support, like now we have, I think, a directory of about 30 to 40 photographers from the Northeast. So without that support, not just financial, but I think just in terms of networking and resources as well. So, otherwise maybe if I hadn't received that support, I would still be here wondering why there are no women photographers here, right? So I agree with your point when you said that grants should expand your mind and, like not really apply for a grant for grant's sake. So moving to
and at the same time, like what you said, grants do give you a certain confidence, that somebody has thought you worthwhile. And so when you're young, I know that means a lot to have someone's affirmation, like Zubaan gave you the affirmation, no? And look what the talk has become now. So that's a very valuable part of grants. I just urge you to read the fine print and know what you're in for. And those that give grants to remember grants are for giving, not for taking.
I like that hashtag, grants are for giving. But I think this, we touched upon this yesterday too, is that the idea of a non-collecting institution being a little more valuable, and grants are not the only thing that they can offer. There are plenty of other formats where organizations can be critical in the exposure of new art and new ideas. Residencies is an interesting format, but also, you know, I also agree quite strongly with what Dayanita was saying, is that you just need to get out there and do it. It's something that I think in the digital age, you know, and I'm not a photographer, but in the digital age, that mechanical aspect, which is what I learned on, is gone, you know? So you still have that basic language of kind of capturing how light falls or balances or envelops form or something. But some people just need a little more work on their communication style.
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, it's like singing. Some people naturally have a voice that makes sounds that other people enjoy. And some people like me, you know, just need a little bit of fine tuning. So you have to really show up for your work. And unless you're ready to show up for your work, unless you're ready to put hours in that aren't necessarily directly related to your photography, you can't expect other people to be doing that for you. Yeah. And I think one really important kind of facilitator or spark, catalyst for creativity is exposure. It's exposure to experiences, it's exposure to ideas. And these don't need to cost money even. You can go talk to people you wouldn't ordinarily speak to. Live a life in someone else's shoes. You can take on a job, take on 2 jobs, do what you have to do, but everything you learn doing those, fulfilling those roles and talking to those people will inspire you or can inspire you in some way. So grants, yes, can be helpful, especially in giving you confidence, I think, and knowing that someone else believes in you. That's important, but you have to show up for your work, I think.
Equally, I think collectives can do that work, you know? That's the grant, the institution. I think, especially after COVID, I'm not sure how much room there will be for the individual mega artist. I think art will have to, you know, land there, or have or possibly already landed on their feet. I mean, you know what I mean, sort of touch base with the earth. And art has been flying out there, and now it'll become more grounded. And one of the things that'll probably happen is that there will be a lot more collectives, and there's a lot of power in collectives. So for example, if you talk about a grant, but as a collective, if you get together and do, for example, something like what Art Chain India has done, or think of something yourself. Right. And similarly, as a collective, you decide to have your own biennale. You decide to have your own exhibition. And it could be, you know, for example, these photo festivals, and I find those problematic, extremely problematic. They like to do prints on vinyl. So these photographs that I may have made to make a print this size have suddenly been blown up that as large as my window and hung from Hawa Mahal, for example. And I just wonder why. And if you want to talk about scale, then the image has to be connected to that, no? Right. The image that you make. But most importantly, I thought, okay, if you want to work with vinyl and you want something that's quick and easy to display, then how about having a guerrilla vinyl exhibition? And suppose you take, each person can carry 2 standees, you know, that roll back in. You know what I'm talking about? I think it's called standees. Like you have outside shops, right? And then you roll it, it all folds into one. Each person can carry 2. And that's your exhibition. And you run to wherever maximum people will come. You set up, you open your standees, you have your exhibition. By the time the police come to tell you you're not allowed to do this, you roll your exhibition and you go to another venue. So, we have to find ways to put our work out there. I convinced Satram Das Chula in 2008 to give me his shop vitrines. He has a jewelry store on Park Street, Raj Mehtani, next to Flurries. And I saw these empty vitrines. I had just sent a letter of those accordion fold books. And I asked him if I could display my work in his vitrines since they were empty. I put them in 2008. You'll find them online. Sent a letter, Park Street, it'll show up. I changed them in 2018 because I had made Museum Bhavan. So for 10 years, I had an exhibition on Park Street for 10 years. Now, which museum show can beat that? 10 years on the footpath. My work was there. The Panwala became the guide to the exhibition. And it's still there. It's just that I've changed center letter to Museum Bhavan. So that's not connected to any institution. It's just me thinking, I want my work to reach people. But why doesn't your collective try the vinyl idea? I don't think anyone has done it now. And it's so easy. You just take it home and then you just say, okay, next Sunday, 11 o'clock, we're meeting at such and such park. So the exhibition keeps moving in different venues in the city. And then maybe...
I love that.
Remember yesterday I was saying that find a name like 7+1 Sisters. And imagine if 7+1 Sisters is doing this in every state. You have little... So just while we are talking, these ideas are developing, no? And this is the power of collectives. And this is what we'll all have to do, not just in the Northeast, but we'll have to form collectives and find ways of putting our work out there. And it can't just be about the big institutions and the big installations anymore. It also just doesn't feel right, no? It doesn't feel right to make the mega work and have the mega shipping going to the mega museum. And so as far as I'm concerned, I feel that the book is going to be the form. And artists are going to find different ways to work with the book. And I already just told you what I was able to do with Center Letter and Museum Bhavan in Calcutta. So 10 years,
yeah.
At least 10,000 people walk past. If 1% of them look at it, what is the number we add up to? I've never calculated it, but it's huge. So do it yourself. Don't wait for grants. Don't wait for institutions. You have your freedom, which is the most valuable thing for an artist, really. Sorry, I went on and on, but.
No, I mean, I think the idea of a collective, particularly in a region as diverse as the Northeast, is incredibly exciting. And if you have all found ways to work together, if you've already created a network, this COVID pandemic is the perfect time to just reevaluate what you want the landscape to look like going forward, and where you want to put your efforts, and what you want to see at the end of it. Because I mean, okay, Dayanita's idea is brilliant. Just walk down into, if you're in Gangtok, go down to MG Marg, set it up down by the Gandhi statue and see what happens. Or if you want to talk with others first, hold a virtual town hall meeting. Think about maybe a virtual mentorship without borders. There's many ways where you can leverage your own kind of strengths to help each other out within this 7+1 Sisters. And you might need to explain that to everyone else now. But you could have a virtual council of advisors. But I think the key is that you want to focus on community. And where we started this conversation with was kind of photographing what you know, photographing the personal. And And I think as a collective, as a community, as a society, we can also ask, have conversations about what we want to preserve and what we want to innovate. And the more we talk about different formats for exhibitions and different opportunities, the more that kind of white box gallery seems really 90s. You know, it's like, there's so many more interesting ways to exhibit. And Instagram is a really easy one. But one of the ones that I loved that I read about the other day and I mentioned was it was a women's group in California. I don't remember where, but they were kind of discouraged about lack of access to galleries, to other people's eyes and interests, which is very similar to what I think people in the Northeast also feel when they look to the center. But what they did was that they organized an exhibition of their collective's work in one of the women's homes. And it became their work situated and exhibited in their community, in the home in which many of these stories had occurred. And so as a viewer, you walk through not only an exhibition, you're not only looking at images, but you get that experiential aspect. You have this experiential dimension where, you know, you can actually impact the gallery goer, the viewer, in more multi-sensory ways. So there's tons of ideas. I mean, this white cube gallery is like, I'm not interested in that anymore.
And also, like, from the art world, I know that while you have these big art fairs, or used to have, it may be a thing of the past, people are always more interested in the off-site fairs, you know? So if there was a group from the Northeast, if 7+1 Sisters became this group that we're hoping it will, it could be that they just, at the time of the Kochi Biennale, they decide to have a pop-up exhibition outside, outside where people are standing in queue, no? You have to wait in a long queue to go into the Kochi Biennale. And so people are just standing there. They would be happy to look at whatever you have to offer. And you just have people walking past with their standees. So you're moving the exhibition through the queue that has formed. And you also then get people looking at the work because they're all anyway interested. They've come to the Kochi Biennale and they realized, oh my God, 7+1 is an excellent collective in the Northeast. And we knew nothing about it. And then they feel stupid and they want to know more. So it's also about sort of playing with and provoking and challenging. And, you know, it can't be all serious and institute and grant and gallery. Right. I mean, there has to be fun in all of it. And once you can only do that if you have your freedom, believe me.
Yeah, sorry.
All these things are just about claiming your freedom.
Dayanita, just to take on from there, I'm taking over for a second from Mridu. Hi, this is Zishani. Taking over because we've had a slight internet drop-off. There are a couple of questions that we'd love to ask that have come in from the audience. One for Pema and one for Dayanita. So I'm just going to go through them one by one for Dayanita and one for Pema, and then we can maybe take them one by one. For Dayanita, the question is, does your lack of support for grants mean that only economically privileged practitioners who have access to the time and resources needed for serious pursuits of the art should be the people who get to do it? So that's one for you. And for Pema, it says, recognizing that every person has differential access to time and to money, how does one show up for their work when one has to counter systemic issues of gender, lack of access in terms of institutions, languages, public space, even internet connectivity and roadways? So this is similar questions for the two of you, and we just
Can you repeat the question, please?
The top question is, does your lack of support for the grants mean that you think that only economically privileged practitioners should have access to
come on, really, you know, is that...
These questions questions, so we'd love for you to actually address them because they must be coming up for a reason. Thank you.
Yes. I'm sure it's coming up for a reason. I have had the privilege of an amazing grant from Robert Frank in 1997, where he gave me, I never met him, $10,000 so that I could do the work I wanted to do. And he didn't ask for anything in exchange. So I'm a great beneficiary of a grant. My lack of support for grants is on the grants where it's a commercial transaction, which forces you to hand over prints that are signed by you. At a later time in your life, you may not want those prints to be exhibited, but you've handed them over because you've got the money to do the work. As far as the resources for doing work are concerned, as I see it, the resource that you need the most when you want to do photography is travel and your day-to-day subsistence. So I would say that it's really important to find a job with which you can do your daily living. And then to try and find work that perhaps you don't need to. I mean, there was a time when it was everybody wanted to go and work either in the Thar Desert or in the Northeast. And if you want to do these very ambitious projects, it's going to be much, much harder to do them. And that becomes a limitation in actually doing your work. Versus if I wanted to do something that was around where I lived, at least I don't have those travel costs. So for the person who's talking about the resources, yes, of course, we all need to earn a living, but you don't have to, it doesn't have to come from photography. It's also very difficult to earn a living from photography now, and it'll only get harder. And the grants are great if they are just grants. That would be amazing. And I hope I can change that with these conversations. That is something, because everyone that is putting a grant out has the best intentions. They do it with the best of intentions. I have no doubt about that. I think they just have not considered what they're asking for in exchange and how that might limit what comes out of the grant, because you made a proposal and you said that I'm going to do the grant on such and such subject. And when you get into it, you might find that there's something even more urgent that needs to be documented. So I wish we had hundreds of grants that just said, this is such an important time. Please go and photograph whatever you think needs to be documented. We need the archive from this time. And the grant shouldn't have to ask for anything in return. And I'm sure people will take that kind of grant very seriously. So I'm not saying no to grants. I am talking about grants that ask what grants ask for in exchange, to be careful about that, to be ready for that, and to be ready for the fact that while you're doing a grant, while you're working on the grant, you get into a situation where you're trying to fulfill the grant's requirements, but your work is actually changing. And so it limits the scope of what you've been able to do, as started to happen to me with the Robert Gardner grant. And because it was a grant that was much later in life for social issues. And finally, I had to convince them that love was a social issue. I think I already said that. So the problem is not the grants. I'm just saying that grants should be for giving and not for taking. I hope that's answered your question.
Pema, so your question was also something similar.
Yeah.
Would you like to?
My question was about showing up for your work, but I do want to just say that with the grants, for example, the Sikkim Palace Archives, I did with the support of a grant. That was because I felt strongly that these were documents that should be in the public domain, that they served no purpose in the private domain, and that nobody should be making money off of them. And thankfully, the owners of the archive also felt the same way. So if you do have material that you are willing to put in the public domain, relinquish your ownership of, and not monetize in any way, then by all means, I think you can avail of many grants. But in terms of showing up for your work, I recognize that that may have come across harshly. I think the point that I was trying to make is that grants are very new. And when you look at the great artists and photographers of the 20th century, very few of them had a single grant. It just didn't exist. One very timely one is Christo, who used to produce, he's an artist, not a photographer, but he used to produce a lot of large scale art with his wife, Jean-Claude. And she passed away about a decade ago. He just passed away this week, which is why it's in my mind. They never once took a grant. All of their work was financed by the selling of his drawings and preparatory work before they would create their institutions. When he first moved or met Jean-Claude, he moved to Paris. He didn't speak French. He didn't speak English. He's, I believe, Hungarian. So he had no access to language, which was, I think, another part of the question that was asked. He didn't even have a toilet. So he lived in a storeroom without a toilet and took on a bunch of other jobs. And his belief in his art and his creativity and his ideas and his desire to bring those ideas to life kind of transcended his more mundane challenges. And I know examples like that can be of limited use. It is easier said than done. But I think one also has to look at one's own expectations. What is your goal as a young aspiring photographer? Where do you want to see your work? What impact do you want to see? What change do you want to see in your work? And then it becomes a little more easier to talk about what methodologies and what platforms and what support networks there are to see that manifest. I think this, sorry, okay.
No, I want to add to that, because I think what you said is, once you build a certain amount of work and then you look for a grant, or then you get invited by an institution to complete the project, which is what some of the grants are offering. I think the Serendipity grant is for an ongoing project. And I think that's really useful. But at the core of it is really building a body of work, building substance there. And that requires a lot of rigor. It requires you to work a lot, and just sometimes waiting for the right grant or waiting for the right institution, a lifetime can go by. And instead you just take whatever, you take your phone camera and you go out and photograph.
I do. Yeah, we have a lot of other questions also coming in.
Well, I thought
okay, I was just,
so we were.
So yeah,
I was just gonna say one thing quickly, is that it was one of my team members on the archives project. I think it was Kunga. I don't know if he's online right now. He showed us a video during the course of that year of Sebastian Salgado, and who said, if you really want to be a good photographer, study psychology. And this is the point. If there is a lot to be said for completing ongoing work, but there's also a lot to be said for the value of experiences and ideas that you get from work that you think is totally unrelated. Everything can be inspiration.
My line used to be, do an MA in literature and then come to photography.
Yes, read.
So,
that's the biggest one.
So we're talking about literature now, so I think it's quite apt, because the next question, it's about reality and fiction. So this is for Dayanita. So the question concerns the reality in fiction. How do we bring out reality in fiction? How does reality affect fiction while writing a book or creating any form of art?
So,
do you want me to repeat the question again?
No. I'm trying to see how I can make this a short answer. Because it starts with the beginning of photography. we all know the history of photography from Daguerre, and Daguerre gets all the appreciation for having invented photography. But what if the history of photography started with Hippolyte Bayard, who was working on similar experiments as Daguerre, but he was convinced by Daguerre's friends to not make his findings public, and meanwhile Daguerre got all the celebration from the French government. And Hippolyte made a portrait of himself sitting on a chair and said, "Portrait of a drowned man," after he did not get the praise that he deserved, or something like that. So is that clear? Have I made it?
Right, yeah.
I wish I had that photograph to show you, but you can check it out. Hippolyte Bayard, Portrait of a Drowned Man. So I always wonder what would have happened to photography if we had accepted right from the start how much fiction photography is. And it's just that it started with Daguerre versus Hippolyte. And maybe Hippolyte would not have done the first selfie, you could call it, the first self-portrait at the very beginning of photography. It was a performance, no? So I feel that all photography especially is fiction. You, as the author, are creating that frame which leaves out something horrific happening on the side and focuses on the flowers, or the other way around. And so images are really shaping reality, and now more than ever before, we all know what fake news does. And I really don't know what the answer to that is, because it's unfortunately part of photography, the fiction and the fakeness of it. So either you play with that form and you use it to say things that you couldn't photograph because you fictionalize it, or you find a form between the two, which can get a little dangerous, especially when you do it in literature and possibly in photography too, because then you're mixing, and that can get very confusing for people. How are they to know which one was what you were trying to get to? But there's the photographer Saurabh Hura does that magnificently, this mix of the fiction and the so-called real, so that you're completely at sea with his book called The Coast. I have it in the other room, but his work is a great example of how he plays with fiction. And I think it's in Coast, where he has 12 stories at the end, where he changes just a few words and the story changes. So he's addressing exactly that, which I think was the question. And it's fascinating. It's something I tried to address in House of Love, and I called it photo fiction. And there's forms to be developed there, but you have to tread carefully, because in this time of the political situation that there is, it can also backfire quite badly, no? So I guess it's really comes back to your own intention and what you want to do with the work. I don't mind how it's created. I don't mind that you set up a situation because that makes the point in a stronger way. And I think artists do that all the time.
Since we're already talking about the book making process and the book reality and fiction, so we had a question which was related to the book and the digital, the offline and the online space. So on the one end of your practice, it has been so much about the haptic sensation of bookmaking, right? Seeing a physical product materializing. And on the other, I believe that now the only place where one can view the entire museum bhavan is online on Google Arts and Culture. So you have this experience of working across, this online and offline mediums. And so how would you describe these experiences? How different or how similar?
It's inevitable, I don't think one can stay just with the book or just stay with the digital. For all the practitioners you were talking about who work on the digital format, for example, that's wonderful, and you have great possibilities through Instagram and through making these sort of virtual exhibitions, which I'm not entirely convinced about. I think other than Mayank Austin Sufi, nobody has really found a form for Instagram that mixes text and image. So I would really recommend to all of you on Instagram to follow the Delhi Wala and see what he does with reality and fiction and image and text. But I'm so glad that I had the sense to put Museum Bhavan on the Google Cultural Institute, because now that all the museums are in different museums in different parts of the world, different continents, Google Cultural Institute is the only way you can actually see all the museums. And so I would say to the photographers who are talking about their digital, they work in the digital field, that there is still great pleasure in actually making a book, making an exhibition. We just have to change the idea of it. We have to change the concept of bookmaking to something where you have to fund 300 or 3,000 books. And so you have to look for a sponsor, to something you just take an A4 sheet and it's folded and folded again and maybe folded again. And maybe you have a book that is 1, 2, 3, 4, but then it opens into another page. And then maybe it opens like that and becomes something else. So we have to the form of the book is great to explore. We haven't even touched its toenail so far. We are just stuck with one kind of book. The advantage with this is, you would print it for 10 rupees or 15 rupees, and you could actually circulate it to people who were willing to pay maybe 20 rupees for it. And if you did it just in black and white, you could, of course, do it for much, much less. So we have to find our forms for the book. And then maybe we find my dream would be that I can have my book version on a website or on Instagram and have a physical book as well. And then I want a physical book at 2 levels also. I would love for Zubaan to publish a physical book which we can sell for, say, $299. Mm-hmm. Yeah, but at the same time, I might want a few copies that are printed with title that are really the best quality that I can have. So it's 3 things we're talking about. We're talking about the Instagram book. We're talking about asking Zubaan if they would consider making, that would be a great conversation to have. Why don't we have mainstream publishers working with photo books? I know cost is the reason, but if you're willing to let go of quality, then couldn't we make a book like Mona for $299? And then there's the possibility of making a grander object, which could also become an exhibition. So the book can also be an exhibition.
So since we're talking about having a conversation with Zubaan, so the Zubaan team, they've just sent me a question asking how come, so this is for both Pema and Dayanita, how come all the names that you cited are men? The artists, the photographers, and not a single woman on this example.
Excuse me, I'm here.
Not as a speaker, but all the examples that you cited are all about are all men, and also I think Western men from the West. But we were talking about marginalized voices here. So this is just a
I'm confused. I'm confused. Which men? I talked about Robert Frank and Robert Gardner as people who gave me a grant.
I talked about Christo and Sebastian Salgado.
Ah, okay.
So I'll take the fall for that one.
But maybe this just goes to show the importance of the conversation that we're having about the Northeast and bringing the marginalized voices to the center,
Listen, 30 years ago, I was the marginalized voice. When nobody in this field, which was all men, would take me seriously at all. And I somehow just stuck it out. And I did what I did in spite of all the men. I did what I did in spite of all the institutions. Yes, I had a terrific mother who supported my madness, or junoon as she calls it. But to Zubaan, I would say you have a pretty solid woman sitting right here. So that changes things quite a bit, I think. At least I hope I've been able to change some of those things. And I must admit that when I see a woman with a camera, you know, I sort of smile to myself. And at a wedding, I tried to talk to some of them and said, you know, it's so nice to see women photographing. And they said, yes, of course. You know, that's what, why not? What's the surprise? And I said, I'm Dayanita. And of course, they didn't know me at all. And so they sort of looked like, who's this auntie talking about what it means to be a woman in photography? That is quite a different, very loaded subject.
Hi, Dayanita. I'm just cutting in for Mridu. I think her internet is also a bit faulty.
Okay.
And so we're just extending the session by 10-15 minutes. And I'd just like to recenter a couple of things that we're trying to address also. And I think one of them is like the overall absence of gender. And while talking about it yesterday also in the conference collective that Mridu works, how they have to approach it. And that was what I think we were trying to talk about. And I think we'd like for you to answer this question, because I think Deepti's put it twice about the romanticization of like literature as a part of photography, because from the kind of the submissions that we've had in Reframing the Domestic, looked at Asha workers, women's collectives from like smaller districts in Assam, from Manipur, also putting up their pictures, and how does privilege and gender play in that scenario when, you know, they're actively working for like less than basic minimum living wage, and they're working on the front lines, they're working in COVID relief while they're trying to put up like, you know, pictures self-documenting. So how do we look at that? How do we center those conversations? How do we not make it about exoticization or romanticization of those? And I would like both you and Pema to come in on this.
I don't think it's romanticization or exoticization to say literature helps you be a photographer. It's like, if you want to really think about a profession or being an artist who works with photography, you have to be able to really understand not just that medium, but all the other related mediums. That's unfortunately the situation that there is. But as far as the people who are photographing, I agree. It's not like saying that you have to read to be able to photograph. It's just about how to make them take ownership of that work as putting it out as their work, what they see, what they think is important. That is what I would stress with them, rather than making pictures that they think the curator would like, or like pictures that they may have seen on the street somewhere. One of the ways, if I had to do a workshop for them and there was no question of spending time reading and all that, is perhaps if there was the possibility of sharing some cinema. I find there's a lot that one can learn about the image from cinema. And how do we work with people who don't have the time to look at anything else? How do we, or the resources? I mean, they're just between work and home, there's absolutely no time. And you're asking them if they would photograph in somewhere in that day. You know?
Exactly. I think, and some of it is also connected to the fact that there has to be economic resources that support that. And I think that was what we were also discussing. Like, you know, there are multiple ways to do it. And I think we had a very long conversation on grants, which I think has been fleshed out enough. But there has to be economic resources and incentivization of this process, because women photographers in the Northeast are difficult for, like, even after like pushing and like, you know, just asking around in networks to get them to submit the photographs. That brings us to the earlier question of like how there's a lack of confidence also, because you do not see yourself represented as much as a Northeast person, as a woman, as belonging to communities that have not, like for an Assamese upper class person, it's different than say for a Bodo woman. So how do we exist within those margins and bring those photographs out, knowing that there are resources we have to expend and on an economic and financial level?
there the grant really comes in, because there you might have to even make sure that you can give them a smartphone, no? So whatever 8,000 rupees or 9,000 rupees that the most basic model costs, that's when I would look for a grant, where I would go to an organization or I would go to Samsung and say, look, we need 50 smartphones because we want to give them to the 7+1 collective to take photographs. And then to simplify the process of them sharing those images with us, which is slightly technical. They may not be able to do that, but is there a way then that their phones become the diary? And that there's an exhibition where you just plug those phones to 8 projectors, if you can, and you just look at, so the phone becomes their archive. And then I would try to, that's when the grant would become crucial, to raise money, and then to have maybe just a 2-hour intensive workshop, very little to talk, just a little bit about the image, just a little bit, LBC, light background corners, just as a way to get them started. And then if they start to look at the phone as their archive, and once a month or once a week, somebody goes to download it from their phone, or they just keep it and it's their archive, and at some point in the future, there's an exhibition of that. Do you think that's something that's doable? Vidisha?
Vidisha, are you there?
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I
What should we do?
I think network is also faulty.
Okay.
So that's been the case mostly, especially in the Northeast.
Yeah.
So it's already 5, but
Mridu, I'm back.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Yeah.
No, I just had a last, because I could hear Dayanita speaking about bringing the photo exhibition, the phone exhibition. And I think to that, that was like the main driving force behind, like, I think reframing the domestic, trying to get people to click photographs and not focusing on what the curator might think would look good, but what would be their experience of the pandemic and the work that they are doing. And I think like getting that and not looking at, like Mridu mentioned about the aesthetic, but how the importance of the stories are, and importance of centering gender into it is far more important at this point of time than any form of like academic rigor or other forms of rigor. So I think that was what, and bringing that together is a form of exhibition for us. So yeah, that was my last comment, like before I completely cut off. So Mridu, you can just.
Yeah, no, I think we can just take a last question for Pema. So this says, Pema, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so yeah, this question's for you. How do you work with institutions, like long-standing institutions like British Library, to uncover lesser-known histories and decolonize archives and unpack work around politics of institutions built on foundations of power to share marginalized narratives and bring them to the public discourse?
That's a big question for the end of the session. It's a good question, and they're all important aspects of a larger discourse. I can only really speak from my experience with the British Library in the digitization of this archives, which were at a certain level state archives. So they were expounded, let's say, the discourse of power in this sense. But our role was not in interpreting it. And I think this interpretation is something that's also, we haven't touched upon, but we should, and it plays into the question of reality and fiction as well. There is no, when we're talking about historical narratives, there is no wrong or incorrect interpretation of experience. Whether one, there will be certain facts, but whether one was in the center or on the periphery, whether one was male or female, whether one was in Gangtok from a Kazi family, or whether they were in Yuksum. They will have all experienced these historical events in a different way. And our role in cataloging, in digitizing, and making these documents available was not to say, this is the correct history, this is the narrative of history that should go down. What we were doing was really to just literally dump it all in the public domain. And from that, you will have people from all sides and who have experienced it in all different ways come in and read the files. And some of them will take one letter as proof or evidence that XYZ happened. And someone will take that same letter, choose a different sentence in it and say, well, look at this. And the idea is really to encourage discourse. What I said at the beginning is that historical discourses, particularly if there's been some sort of sensitivity, are often become so polemical, it's difficult to have meaningful, measured conversations about them. They become very quickly heightened. They become very emotional, even for second and third generation participants who did not experience it. And I relate to that also. I feel emotional about this in many ways, but they can also become very sensationalist. You know, I've heard people talk about the atrocities that happened in Sikkim, and atrocities is a very strong word. I would use the word atrocities when we talk about other areas of India, perhaps, definitely when we're talking about issues like Rwanda, Darfur, when we talk about what's happened even with police brutality in the States last week, that was an atrocity, and it's an atrocity that continues. But it's very easy to get wrapped into one's own and lose perspective. So I think this idea of making everything available and not interpreting it for other people, but allowing other people to interpret it for themselves is what's important.
But just says, from my personal curiosity also, all these archives are now in British Library. So do we have access to it, or is it available to us here? Like, can we access it from Sikkim?
Yep, you can. Okay. That was the point.
Great.
Yeah.
No, because I've been asking a lot of people about this, and they have no idea. So maybe I can talk to you later about this.
Yeah, I think the British Library at the I think this year they did something where they were switching their database, so they said it's offline, but it should be back online soon. And I left a hard copy with NIT. So if you're in Gangtok, NIT has instructions to allow anyone to use it.
Okay. Okay. So thank you so much, Pema and Dayanita. That was a very intense and enlightening session. So since this is the final Through Her Lens conversations, I would just like to take a moment to talk about the experience of putting together the exhibition and the webinar. So, so Through Her Lens, you know, you see it as a photographic platform, but for me and the team, it's essentially a storytelling platform, you know, and also perhaps because storytelling is so rooted in our indigenous communities. And so Reframing the Domestic, which is the current exhibition, it tries to bring out stories of women and other marginalized identities from Northeast India during the COVID-19 lockdown. So what our thought process and what we believed was that every single person, you know, regardless of the gender, race, class, will have their own unique experience. And one person's interpretation of the domestic space is very different from another's, right? So we did not want to stand as gatekeepers to these stories. So we, you know, this has been done enough already, especially in the context of Northeast India, ever since the colonial times, you know, when one narrative was privileged over another, and especially therefore, so what images as curators and as an institution, as Zubaan, so what images you choose to include and what you exclude, it may not seem important right now, but in the larger scheme of things, I think it has important consequences for the future also. So I think, as Dolly Kikon, she said in the very first seminar, like, no image is irrelevant. So that was
Yes,
our belief as well. So,
absolutely.
and right. So this is why we did not meddle with any person's story. We have made very little changes to the captions except for the grammatical errors. And we haven't touched the images. In fact, we haven't even rejected any images, just because, they don't meet any certain aesthetic standard, or they don't lend a finesse to the exhibition. So we wanted to limit interventions and, ensure, like, what we really wanted to do was ensure that the power of the story remains with the storyteller, and Through a Lens is simply a space for these stories to come out. But yeah, having said that, we were also constantly questioning this issue of representation. When we are collecting and chronicling visual stories, there's so much we're also leaving out, right? So especially like in the past, it was only the elite few who could afford a camera, and now their stories form a part of the visual history, but there are also those who have been left out of the frame. So this is and especially like in the context of Northeast, like people who photographed a place and a people, so they have perpetuated this single story, which continues until today. And like I said, it's very problematic in a lot of ways that we may not realize. For instance, like we talked about exoticizing the Northeast, and it's not just in terms of representation, but also I feel, in appropriation of our land. Like there's so many dams being built in Sikkim and Arunachal, why? Because they want to bring development to the tribal people. So, I'm not saying that visual narratives, it's the colonial photographs which have brought this, like it's because of them solely, but visual narratives it's a very powerful form of knowledge production. And we were very much aware of that. That is why all the stories that have come in have found a space in THL. But yeah, so but we are also very aware that we've left a huge section of the society out because they have no access to the digital, and we make no claims to have represented the entire spectrum of marginalized experience in the Northeast. And like today, I think we just have a lot to think about, and we just have to go through this intense labor of conversation and communication, to really understand how we can make visual storytelling and research more democratic and inclusive, like we spoke about. So yeah, so we would be more than happy to continue the conversation. We're more than happy to take questions and comments from the participants even beyond the webinar, and continue the dialogue that we've started. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us, especially Pema and Dayanita. And yeah, so I hope we can continue the conversation even outside of this webinar. Right. So before I leave, the recording of our other webinars in the series are now up on YouTube. You'll find the link in the chat box. And further, if you wish to watch our previous sessions on a crisis of care, feminist perspectives on the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown in India, you can also find the link to the YouTube page in the chat box. And please do make sure you follow us on social media for future events. Thank you so much and have a good weekend. Bye.
Hello, I'm Anusha Pradhan, and I've been curating Reframing the Domestic exhibition along with Mridu and Zubaan team. I'm just going to speak a little bit about the idea behind Reframing the Domestic exhibition and webinar series. So, visual storytelling has become one of the most powerful forms of contemporary knowledge production. With Through Her Lens Reframing the Domestic, we wanted to harness this potential of the visual medium in order to give a space and form to the multiple but isolated experiences of women and other marginalized identities during the COVID-19 lockdown in the northeastern states of India and Darjeeling Hills. The idea of the exhibition was not to prioritize aesthetics, although we have received some excellent photo series from professional and amateur photographers, but to make available a space for voices from the peripheries and the center to create a shared experience, to learn to listen to every voice. As Meena Sutradhar, a women leader from the district of Kokrajhar in Assam and a contributor to Reframing the Domestic, has said, quote, "The gender divide continues to exist because women hardly ever get any opportunity to express themselves," unquote. Again, in the words of Ikla Subba, another contributor to Reframing the Domestic and a student of English journalism from the Indian Institute of Mass Communication, Delhi, quote, "Even something as simple as having more conversations around the everyday lived experiences of women can go a long way in understanding ourselves and encouraging solidarity across gender," unquote. This is the very ethos of Through Her Lens, and Reframing the Domestic follows in the same spirit. As we said earlier, the visual medium holds immense power. In Northeast India and Darjeeling Hills, the effects of colonial photography are still with us in our everyday lives. The selective stories consumed by an audience that excluded the very community whose stories were being told have become the authoritative renditions of our people and places. The single story of mystical mountains, romantic landscapes, simple tribal people has ensured that the region is contained within the margins. With Reframing the Domestic, we have attempted to disrupt these hegemonic accounts and selective storytellings to find a place for a range of experiences in order to understand our collective existence and not be reduced to myopic narratives. As part of the online exhibition, we also hosted 4 webinars titled Reframing the Domestic Conversations with women photographers, curators, and researchers. Feminist ethics, consent, challenges of representation, and power relations in photography were some of the themes we touched upon during these conversations. The speakers in each session shared diverse opinions on these topics, informed by their own professions and practices. And just like the visual stories in the exhibition, each perspective finds a space on the platform, even if they are at odds with our own. We feel that it is important to be open to all voices and critique them through our own understandings. Reframing the Domestic has been a learning experience for us curators as well, often emotional and difficult. It has also made us confront our own privilege during the lockdown and otherwise. At the end of this project, we are more determined than ever to work closely with communities and bring out the stories that don't find a place in people's consciousness. Thank you again for joining us for Reframing the Domestic online exhibition and webinar series.